In this section, we'll look at some of the movies and sports, some of the entertainment of the 1970s. Certainly during the decade, the established entertainment corporations, ABC, NBC, and CBS, along with public television, they dominated traditional broadcast TV. With the deregulation of the decade, however, the networks of cable subscribers began to grow. Now, in the 1970s, the first pay-per-view movie network began and was called Home Box Office, or HBO. In the late 70s, the entrepreneur Ted Turner distributed his Atlanta station on cable, and it became what he called the first superstation, the Turner Broadcasting System. In 1980, Turner launched the Cable News Network, or CNN, right at the beginning of the next decade. You see on the left here an early cable TV converter box. Recording of videos took off in the 1970s with VCRs, video cassette recorders. In 1976, Sony Corporation introduced the Betamax, and 3 years later, RCA Corporation introduced the VHS. The two systems, Beta and VHS, battled for dominance before VHS system won out in the early 1980s. When it came to what was on television, when it came to things like network TV, certainly the westerns declined, but crime dramas prospered. Shows like Charlie's Angels and Starsky and Hutch and Hawaii Five-0. Sitcoms remained a staple of television throughout the 1970s, but there is one that's really super notable. Norman Lear's sitcom All in the Family with Archie Bunker character were famous because it wasn't just trying to entertain. It had controversial, socially relevant material. Archie Bunker was a racist, and they made fun of it, and it was called a parody, and no one had done that message comedy before. There was also the sitcom MASH, and that had been originally a book in the Korean War, and then was made into a 1970s movie, and then it converted to a series that was very popular, continued into the early 80s. When MASH went off air in the early 80s, it was one of the most watched episodes, the last episode ever on TV. During the 1970s, soap operas and game shows were even growing in more popularity than they've been in the 60s. And some of them still around today. You've got things like Family Feud, The Price is Right, or Hollywood Squares. Science fiction shows were also popular. One of the more popular science fiction shows was The $6 Million Man, starring Lee Majors as a guy that had a number of bionic parts, and he could do superhuman things. And there was the Incredible Hulk, and there was the Wonder Woman. So these shows were very popular during the decade. The decade saw a number of very famous movies, each spawning a number of sequels, and you may be familiar with them. There was the Jaws on the top left, and Star Wars on the bottom right here. There's The Godfather, and then on the bottom left, the Rocky movie. All were the 70s, and they all spawned sequels that even continue up to the day. With the growth of TV and new television contracts, professional football exploded in popularity during the 1970s. There was no league agreement to limit spending, and so you have dynasties forming. And two of the most famous dynasties from the 70s were the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys. The NFL showed its games on Sunday because college games were on Saturday, but the NFL begins to regularly schedule Monday night football games. They had experimented with some different dates in the late 60s, but in the 1970s, Monday Night Football was a big hit with Howard Cosell shown here in the right in the middle. As the wealth poured into the professional sports leagues, the players protested they weren't getting their fair share, and they filed lawsuits. And the result of all this was the creation of free agency. And, contracts for big-name players exploded. In 1979, for example, the baseball player Nolan Ryan, shown here on the right in the baseball card, he became the first $1 million player a year in baseball. Sports heroes included Hank Aaron, who famously broke Babe Ruth's home run record that had lasted for decades. And he did what all these sports heroes did. He had not only a contract with his team, but he signed lucrative endorsement contracts with businesses. Famously, Aaron signed a $5 million deal with Magnavox. Another sports hero, certainly up north, was the hockey player Wayne Gretzky, who dominated the National Hockey League. Despite Palestinian terrorist attacks at the 1972 Olympics in Munich, Germany, the Olympics were known for the success of the American swimmer Mark Spitz. He won 7 gold medals, which at the time was a record, and this is a very famous picture of him marketing his success. For basketball fans, it's interesting to note that the 1970s saw the National Basketball Association, the NBA, begin a three-point shot, which of course then spread throughout basketball. Kind of growing from the whole running boom was, you see in the 1970s, the first Ironman triathlon, which of course had a marathon and had a distance swim and a distant bike ride to boot. And that is something that has grown in popularity as well. There was also a hyped, interesting to note, made-for-television VIT that happened in 1973. You have sort of a sexist, or a person playing a sexist, Bobby Riggs, challenging Billie Jean King, the reigning female tennis champion. And Billie Jean King won in what was marketed as the battle of the sexes, but it certainly made a lot of money for everybody. In any event, this sort of concludes the section on the entertainment and sports industry in the 1970s.